Hey there, it's Simon Hurley from Inklips, and welcome to another video. I hope you all are having a wonderful day. Now today I'm going to be sharing how to use Wendy Vecchi's fun stamps and also her stencils in order to color the images in using inks. And I'm also going to be sharing how to use Ranger's Archival ink and the new Wendy Vecchi Make Art Blendable ink together to create a really fun effect on your card since they're formulated differently. So without further ado, let's turn down to my work surface and get right on into the tutorial. Okay, so to start off here, I'm going to be showing how to create this first card that's colored in this floral here, but it's got a little bit of bleeding ink. So I'm using the birthday art stamp and stencil set from Wendy Vecchi. So this has that wonderful stamp set with a couple of those florals in there, and then the stencil is cut perfectly to color in some of those images using ink pads and a blending tool. So I'm going to stamp this large floral stamp onto some watercolor cardstock, and I'm using this in the stamping platform just because I can get a perfect image on that rough watercolor texture. So I'm using Archival ink for this from Ranger. So this is just the jet black ink, and this won't bleed since it's waterproof. So if we do any watercoloring later, this ink will not move and it'll stay put with all those details, which is super important. So then after I'm done stamping that down, I'm going to use the Peat moss in the Archival ink with the Wendy Vecchi color. And I'm going to use that stencil and line up the leaves here. So this is pretty easy. You want those two larger binder holes to be on the left side, and that's how you know it's going to line up nicely. So I'm going to go in with my blending tool here and just add some color. And I'm starting off right from the center and then moving out so it gets a little bit of shading in there too. And since this is Archival ink as well, this will not move later on. So this will stay put if we put any water on this sheet, which is really important to the design here. So I'm going to do the same thing down with the stem below there, add a little bit of shading in with that peat moss ink, and then I'm going to move on to ink blending the center of the flower. Now I'm using one of these Ranger detail blending tools because it's really tiny and it'll get those tiny little spaces nicely. But then I'm going to move on with the Make Art Wendy Vecchi ink. So this is reactive with water, so if I spray this later on, this will run all over the cardstock. So I'm just going to add a little bit of shading into the center of the flower with this red geranium color here. And this is super easy to do with these little tiny detail blending tools. It's really easy to get into all those little tiny spaces and add some ink into there. So I'm just adding it right from the center of that flower and going out just a little tiny bit. Then I'm going to bring in my mini blending tool, and I'm just going to go in with the orange blossom ink and blend some of that red out. So I'm filling right in the middle, but still leaving a little bit of room on the end of the flower. So just blending these two inks together really nicely. And because I have this stencil over top, it protects anything outside of that flower. So all that will stay really nice and clear as I color this in. I'm going in to fill this last one in with the sunflower ink, which is this really nice bright yellow, and then I'll blend in really nicely with that orange and red color, and again it's protected by that stencil there. So after I'm done with that, I'm going to lift off that stencil, and here's how it looks. You can completely leave it just like this, but since I like to go a little bit overboard, I'm going to show you how to get this fun bleeding effect. So we used that black ink and the peat moss ink purposefully in Archival ink, and that's because I didn't want those to run. I just wanted the yellow, red, and orange to run a little bit on the cardstock and not mix with those other colors. So those two stay put, and then the yellow starts to bleed all over the place, which is really nice and gives you this fun effect. So I'm going to go in and heat this up with my heat tool since I'm a little bit impatient. And once I'm done, here is how it looks. It's really nice, but it did soften some of that color there. So I'm going to really quickly and easily bring back that stencil, line it right up over top, and then I'm just going to add a little bit more yellow ink inside there. So this just brightens back up that flower and gives it a little bit more intense color inside of there. And I really love these stencils because you can keep going back over and over. So if you want to change something or add more color, it's really easy to do. Okay, so then I'm bringing this over to my wire guide trimmer here, and I'm just going to line it up in the center of that cardstock and then add a little cut going up and then stop right when you get to the image and then do the same thing on the top side there. So that creates that straight line going up and down through our image, and then I can take my scissors and go from either end of that and cut around the image, leaving a little bit of border. So that will just make it so that there's a straight line going down there and your image is just poking right out of that. So it gives a really fun design for this image to add some interest to the card. Then for the sentiment, I'm gonna stamp down the sentiment that says, "One step at a time, you got this, my friend." And I really love how encouraging that one is. So I just fit that right in some little space there. And then I'm going to add that onto a card base with lots of foam tape. And I'm going to add some Aqua Flow shimmer pen to this, just to add a little bit of sparkle that won't come off in your hands, but it just adds a little extra something. So then here's how the finished card looks. You can see a little bit of that sparkle on camera here, but in real life, that's just stunning. Okay, so for the next card, I'm sharing a variation on that same technique that I just shared, but it's just a little bit different. So I'm using this notepad stamp from Wendy, and I'm stamping this down into some black Archival ink on watercolor cardstock here. And I really love this stamp. It just gives you an area to kind of stamp, color, and embellish on for your card. So then I'm gonna go in and take some brown Archival ink, this is Acorn, and I'm going to stamp an image from that same birthday art stamp set. It's just a little bit of a different floral, and I really love these images. So I'm just gonna fit these together like a little puzzle here on this note card. So flipping the stamp around until I find another position, and you just want to vary it a little bit each time. So once I've got 4 of those flowers on, I can really easily go around and just cut this out. It's pretty straightforward since it's got straight lines on each edges, so it's not too difficult. I'm just using my shears to do that. And then I'm going to go in and add some ink here. So I'm doing the similar thing to what I just did. I'm using that detail blending tool into some Make Art ink here. This is the Cornflower blue color, and I'm just gonna add some shading to the center. So for this part, I didn't need that stencil to cover the top. I'm just dabbing right around the inside of those petals where a little bit of shading and dimension would be, and then I'm going to just add a little bit of color to each flower. So this just makes it a little bit more realistic and adds some dimension onto your flower. So some of these images on these stencils are really close together. So to avoid inking through them when I'm trying to ink one image, I just use a little bit of purple tape, and that just makes sure that I don't get color where I don't want it. So I'm trying to get that little small flower right there. And then the binder holes are on the left here, and then it just takes a second to line each little flower up. I find kind of one petal that's a little specific, and then I'll line it up with that one, so it's pretty easy to do. Then I'm going to go in with this Bluebird color, which is a little bit lighter, in my mini ink blending tool, and I'll blend out that darker color too. So you can see that fun shading and dimension that little bit of color at the beginning added. So then I'm going to move into ink blending on the leaves here, and these ones are really simple because the shape is really defined. So I'm going to go in with this Fern green color here, and to do this, I just start on top of the flower shape there that's protected, and then I'll go out and I'll just kind of swirl my ink there. And that creates a little bit of a shadow right around that flower because this ink is translucent. So when you layer it up like that and kind of start from the inside, you get a little bit of shading and dimension there. So I'll do it over here. I'm starting on top of that flower there, and I'll bring my ink out slowly. So that builds up the color in the center there and makes it a little bit lighter around the edges. So that really helps to build up some dimension there. Now I'm going in with those detailed blending tools again, and I'm just going to bring in some sunflower right into the center of those flowers, and then I'll just brighten them up a little bit, and adding some yellow on the inside there complements that lovely blue flower. So once I'm done blending the ink on the inside there, here's how that panel looks. So you could totally leave it here like I mentioned earlier. This looks really nice, and I love the coloring that you did with the stencil. But then I'm going to go in and just add a little bit of water here. So I'm spraying from over top of the images, and this just gets a little bit of that color to start running on your cardstock and moving around. So by doing this and spraying it, it moves those colors, but it keeps the archival ink in place. So that acorn brown that we stamped the images in stays in place, as well as the jet black around the edges. So that's why I use both of those inks together, because one moves if you want that effect, and one of them stays put. So then I'm going in here once I have heat set all that and dried it down, and I'm going to bring in a Copic marker, and wherever there should be shading, I'm going to add a little bit here. So right around those edges to cover up some of that stamping that I did, and also I did the little binding holes over top. So here's how it looks once it's all complete. You can see some of that blue color moved around when I sprayed it. So then I'm going to take the Heartfelt Thanks sentiment. I really like this black lettering, and then I'm going to cut that out into 2 little strips there, and I can add this right on top of that notepad. So I just cut them out and then use some foam tape to pop them up onto the flower background that we just created. Then I used lots of foam tape on the back of that as well to add some dimension, and I'll add that right on top of a craft note card. So this just kept it really simple, but I think that fun notepad background is really nice and detailed and didn't need much more for that card. So then, since I'm a little bit extra, I'm going in with a white gel pen here and just dotting the center of each of those flowers. I thought that it needed a little bit more brightening up, so by adding that, it just draws your eyes to the center of those flowers and adds a little bit more detail. So here's a final look at that finished card, and I think that background looks really nice. So for this last card here, I'm just going to share how to add even more depth and dimension while you're blending with your inks here. So this I'm just doing on regular cardstock, and I'm still using that Archival black ink. It'll just give a really nice image as I stamp the outline here. So I've stamped that down, and then I'm going in with a stencil here, matching that set. I'll have all these links down below. And then I'm going to start my blending here. So I'm using that Sunshine Make Art ink, and I'm just going around the edges and pulling some of that color in. So by doing this, it leaves that inside of that flower a little bit lighter, and this adds even more dimension here. So I'm just gonna go right around the edges and pick up more ink each time, and then you can see that little center there has less ink. Now to add even more dimension, I'm going in with the Orange Blossom ink and those little detail blending tools, and I'm just gonna touch it onto the center of each of those petals. So by doing that, since the leaves are kind of curled over each other, it adds a little bit of shading and makes it a more realistic look, but I still kept the center there kind of lighter so that it keeps some dimension. Now for these leaves, I'm just going in, I'll do a full coat of a really light coverage, and then I'll bring even more ink in from the edges there, and that creates some shading since they're underneath that flower there. So you can see that fun shading on those leaves. And then to do that top of the flower there, I'm going to add a little bit of red, and for some shading I'm bringing in some Acorn. So this brown color will just add a little bit of shading to that red. And don't be afraid to use the grays or browns as shading as well on top of the other colors. It just gives a little bit of a harsher shadow, so be careful, but you can still get some awesome effects with that. So I'm going in with that Orange Blossom ink for this little sprout on top. And then I'm going to add some red geranium for a little bit of shading. So just mixing a little bit of color there, but it creates a really fun blend on the top. So once I'm done with that, I cut that all out just by hand, and then I'm going to take my white gel pen and I'm just going to add some dots and also some lines to follow some of the lines of the designs there. So by doing this again, it just adds a little bit more extra detail. So to create my background, I'm using this Country Gingham background stamp, and I'll stamp it down in some black Archival ink on this gray perfect cardstock here. And to do this, I'm just laying it down on top of that background stamp, and I'll lay a piece of cardstock right over top and give it some nice pressure, and that'll transfer all the ink onto the background there. So once you're done, here's a closer look. It's a little bit more detailed in real life, but I'll cut that down, and that gives me a fun little paper to work on. So now I stamped down this I Adore You sentiment, but to create a banner, I took 2 other little strips and cut a fishtail in each one, and then I'll lay those down with some adhesive, and I'll add the sentiment right over top using some foam tape for some dimension. So here's how the finished card looks once it's complete. I just love all that fun shading and coloring you can get using the stencils. So what'd you guys think? I hope you really enjoyed that video and learned a little bit more about coloring in images using inks. If you did like it, please give it a big thumbs up, and also click that subscribe button down below, and that little bell icon next to the subscribe button will make sure that you'll never miss another crafty video like this one from me. Also, please leave a comment down below letting me know which card was your favorite from today's tutorial and what you think about blending with inks. I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions down there, and I'll see you all very soon for another card making and crafting video. Bye!